The third party walked away in tears. But his final words, "You're the one I love," changed everything. Something happened last night that you may not fully understand yet. A conversation reached a point where nobody could pretend anymore. The words that had been avoided, delayed, softened, or hidden behind excuses finally came into the open. Someone who had been standing between two hearts realized that they could no longer hold on to a place that was never truly theirs. And when they finally walked away, the silence they left behind was heavier than any argument could have been. But then came the words that changed everything. "I'm sorry. You're the one I love." Those words were not spoken casually. They came after hesitation, after confusion, after an emotional battle that had been building beneath the surface for far longer than anyone realized. And perhaps that is why this message feels so powerful to you right now. You have wondered whether the connection you feel is real. You have wondered whether this person still thinks about you. You have wondered whether the distance means the story is over. You have wondered whether someone else entered their life and became more important than you. You may even have asked yourself why the universe, destiny, or God would allow something so meaningful to become so complicated. But sometimes the most confusing season is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the moment when hidden truth begins coming into the light. Think about what happens when a room has been dark for a long time. At first, opening the curtains can almost hurt your eyes. Everything that was invisible suddenly becomes visible. You notice things you did not know were there. You see what needs to be changed. You see what was beautiful. You see what was broken. And most importantly, you can no longer pretend you cannot see. That is what happened emotionally last night. Someone finally saw the truth. And the truth was not simply about another person. The truth was about the heart. For a long time, this person may have tried to convince themselves that they could move forward without confronting what they really felt. They may have tried to choose the easier road. They may have believed that avoiding a difficult conversation would prevent pain. They may have thought that time would make their feelings disappear, but time did something completely different. It made the feelings harder to ignore. Every quiet moment brought your memory back. Every familiar place carried an echo. Every conversation with someone else seemed to remind them of what was missing. And eventually, the person who had been standing in the middle of this emotional situation realized something they could no longer escape. You were not simply someone they remembered. You were someone they still loved. That realization does not mean everything becomes perfect overnight. It does not erase mistakes. It does not automatically repair every wound. But it changes the direction of the story, and that is why last night mattered. There was a moment when the third party realized that the situation was not what they had believed it was. Perhaps they had thought they were winning. Perhaps they believed they had finally become the important person. Perhaps they interpreted attention, communication, or emotional closeness as proof that the connection between them was permanent. But sometimes attention is not love. Sometimes proximity is not intimacy. Sometimes someone can be physically present while another person occupies the deepest part of the heart. And that distinction became impossible to ignore. The third party eventually understood that they could not compete with something that existed beneath the surface. They could not force a heart to belong to them. They could not manufacture a feeling that was not naturally there. And when that realization finally became undeniable, emotions spilled over. There were tears. There was disappointment. There was a sense of loss. There may have been questions that nobody knew how to answer. But then came the sentence that made the entire situation different: "You're the one I love." Imagine the silence after those words. Imagine how many emotions could exist inside a single second. Regret, relief, fear, hope, confusion, love. Sometimes one sentence carries the weight of months or even years of unspoken emotion, and perhaps you have been waiting for clarity without even realizing how much you needed it. You have spent enough time questioning yourself. You have wondered if you imagined the connection. You have wondered whether the signs were meaningful or whether your heart simply wanted them to mean something. You have wondered whether this person cared as deeply as you did, and maybe there were moments when you almost convinced yourself to stop caring, but then something would happen, a memory would return, a feeling would rise, a strange coincidence would make you pause. A song would remind you of them, a familiar name would appear unexpectedly. A dream would leave you thinking about them for hours. You would tell yourself to move on, yet something inside you would whisper that the story was not finished. This message is not asking you to chase anyone. It is not asking you to force a relationship. It is not telling you to ignore reality or overlook someone's actions. Instead, let this be a reminder that your worth does not depend on whether another person chooses you. You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. You deserve honesty. You deserve someone whose actions eventually match their words. And if someone truly loves you, that love must eventually become visible through responsibility. Consistency, communication, and genuine effort. Words can open a door. Actions determine whether someone is willing to walk through it. That is important, because perhaps the biggest change last night was not simply that someone said, "You're the one I love." Perhaps the biggest change was that they finally admitted the truth to themselves. There is a difference. When someone admits something privately, they can still run from it. When someone speaks it aloud, the truth becomes real. And once something becomes real, it becomes much harder to bury. This person may have spent a long time trying to separate their emotions from their decisions. They may have told themselves that love was not enough. They may have focused on circumstances. They may have listened to other people. They may have worried about what would happen if they followed their heart. Maybe they feared rejection. Maybe they feared judgment. Maybe they feared repeating an old mistake. Maybe they were simply afraid of how deeply they felt. Because sometimes people do not run from what they dislike. They run from what matters too much. They run because caring deeply makes them vulnerable. And vulnerability can be frightening. If someone has been hurt before, genuine love can feel dangerous, not because love itself is dangerous, but because it asks a person to become honest. It asks them to stop hiding. It asks them to admit when they are wrong. It asks them to let another person see the parts of themselves they normally protect, and that may be exactly what happened last night. something broke open, not necessarily something destructive, something emotional, something that had been locked away. The third party may have walked away believing they had lost, but perhaps they did not lose a person, perhaps they simply lost an illusion. An illusion that love could be controlled, an illusion that being present automatically meant being chosen, an illusion that someone could silence their deepest feelings forever. And sometimes losing an illusion is painful, but it is also the beginning of truth. You do not need to celebrate another person's pain. You do not need to wish suffering upon anyone. You do not need revenge. You do not need to prove that you were right. Your peace is more important. If this person truly comes toward you, let them come with honesty. Let them come with accountability. Let them come ready to explain what happened rather than expecting you to pretend nothing happened. Let them come prepared to rebuild trust instead of demanding immediate forgiveness. Love can be powerful, but healthy love is not built on confusion, it is built on truth, and perhaps that is the deeper meaning behind everything that happened. The third party walked away because the truth could no longer remain hidden. The person you care about finally recognized the difference between comfort and connection. They recognized the difference between attention and emotional belonging. They recognized that avoiding a decision was still a decision, and somewhere inside that realization, your memory became impossible to ignore. Maybe they remembered your voice. Maybe they remembered a conversation you once had. Maybe they remembered a moment when you understood them without requiring an explanation. Maybe they remembered how safe it felt to be themselves around you. Maybe they remembered something small that you thought they had forgotten. That is how memories work. The moments that matter most are not always the dramatic ones. Sometimes it is the ordinary moment, a laugh, a look, a quiet conversation, a message received at exactly the right time, a moment when someone stayed when they could have walked away, a moment when you offered understanding instead of judgment, a moment when you made them feel seen. Those moments can remain inside a person for years, and sometimes another relationship can distract someone from those memories temporarily. But distraction is not the same thing as healing. Eventually, silence returns. Eventually, the heart speaks. Eventually, a person has to confront what they have been avoiding, and last night, that confrontation may have arrived. There may have been a question asked that changed the atmosphere completely. Do you really love me? Maybe that question was directed toward them. Maybe they had been asked to choose. Maybe they had been challenged to stop giving mixed signals. And perhaps for the first time, they understood that staying silent would hurt everyone more. So they answered, "You're the one I love." Those words may have surprised even the person who said them, because sometimes people discover their truth at the exact moment they are forced to speak it. They may have thought they were confused, but when the moment came, their heart answered before their fear could interfere. That does not mean they have everything figured out. It means they finally know what they cannot deny. And now comes the part that matters most. What will they do with that truth? That is where the next chapter begins. Because love is not proven by a dramatic sentence. Love is proven by what happens afterward. If this person truly understands what they feel, their next steps should bring greater clarity, not greater confusion. They should communicate. They should take responsibility. they should stop allowing other people to interfere. They should be honest about what happened, they should respect your boundaries, they should understand that trust cannot be rebuilt through promises alone, and if they are serious, they will show it. You do not need to chase them, you do not need to send endless messages. You do not need to compete with anyone, you do not need to convince someone that you are worthy of love. Your value existed before this person recognized it. Your value remains whether they return or not. Remember that, because the most beautiful part of this message is not that someone finally said they loved you. The most beautiful part is that you are beginning to understand that you should never have to beg someone to see your worth. You deserve a love that recognizes you without requiring you to disappear inside someone else's uncertainty. Maybe this chapter has taught you patience. Maybe it has taught you boundaries. Maybe it has taught you that love without communication becomes confusion. Maybe it has taught you that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Maybe it has taught you that you can love someone and still choose yourself. Those lessons are not wasted. Nothing you learned during this season was wasted. Even the nights when you felt alone taught you something. Even the unanswered questions taught you something. Even the moments when you wondered whether you should let go taught you something. They taught you that your peace matters. They taught you that your intuition deserves attention but also wisdom. They taught you that hope should never require you to abandon reality, and they taught you that real love should eventually become clearer, not more chaotic. So if this person comes back, do not only listen to the words, listen to the consistency, watch the effort, notice whether they respect your boundaries, notice whether they communicate when things become difficult. Notice whether they are willing to repair what was damaged. Notice whether they are choosing you in ordinary moments, not merely emotional ones. Anyone can speak passionately during a dramatic night. The deeper question is what happens on an ordinary Tuesday morning. What happens when nobody is watching? What happens when there is disagreement? What happens when life becomes stressful? What happens when choosing love requires patience? That is where commitment becomes visible. And perhaps this person is beginning to understand that. Perhaps last night was not simply an emotional confession. Perhaps it was the first step toward becoming more honest. Maybe they finally realized that avoiding you did not erase you. Maybe they realized that pretending not to care did not make the feelings disappear. Maybe they realized that another person could be wonderful and still not be the person their heart truly wanted. That realization can be painful. It can also be liberating, because once a person stops pretending, they can finally make honest decisions. And that is what you should want, not manipulation, not competition, not jealousy, not a relationship built around fear of losing each other. You should want two people freely choosing each other, that is different, that is stronger, that is healthier, and perhaps that is the transformation beginning now. The third party walked away in tears. But their departure does not need to become the center of your story. The center of your story is truth. The center is healing. The center is the realization that you do not have to fight for a place in a heart that genuinely wants you there. If someone chooses you, they should choose you freely. If someone loves you, they should eventually have the courage to live honestly according to that love, and if they cannot, you still have the right to walk forward. That is your strength. You are not powerless while waiting for someone else to make a decision. You are living your own life. You are becoming wiser. You are growing. You are learning what you will and will not accept. You are becoming more emotionally aware, and perhaps that is why this moment feels different. You are not the same person who entered this confusing chapter. You have changed. You understand yourself better. You understand love differently. You know now that attraction is not enough. You know chemistry is not enough. You know words are not enough. You need honesty. You need respect. You need trust. You need mutual effort. You need peace. And perhaps the person you care about is finally learning those same lessons. Maybe they thought love was simply a feeling. Now they are realizing that love is also a responsibility. It is the responsibility to communicate, the responsibility to be truthful, the responsibility to stop hurting people unnecessarily, the responsibility to acknowledge mistakes, the responsibility to make choices rather than keeping everyone suspended in uncertainty. Last night may have forced that lesson upon them, and perhaps that is why their final words were so important. I'm sorry. And then, you're the one I love. The first sentence acknowledges the past, the second reveals the heart, but the future will be determined by what comes next, so do not rush. Let reality unfold. Do not create an entire future from one emotional moment. Do not ignore warning signs simply because you want the ending to be beautiful. Instead, remain open while remaining grounded. You can hope without becoming consumed by hope. You can love without abandoning yourself. You can forgive without immediately restoring trust. You can believe that people can change while still requiring them to demonstrate that change. That is wisdom, and maybe wisdom is exactly what this season has been preparing you for, because perhaps the relationship you imagined before was based mostly on emotion, but the relationship that could exist now, if both people choose it responsibly, would need something deeper. It would need maturity. It would need honesty. It would need patience. It would need two people who are willing to stop running from difficult conversations. And that is why last night may have been significant. Something ended, but something else may have begun. The third party's role in the story may have reached its conclusion. The confusion may have reached a turning point. The hidden feelings may have finally been spoken, and now the question is no longer, does this person feel something? The question becomes, what are they willing to do about it? That question belongs to the future. You do not have to answer it tonight. You do not have to predict every detail. You do not have to search for signs every minute. Let actions reveal what words cannot. If they are serious, you will eventually see movement. If they are sincere, you will eventually see consistency. If they truly value you, they will not ask you to live permanently in uncertainty. And if they return, remember who you became while they were away. Do not shrink back into the version of yourself that accepted confusion simply because you were afraid of losing them. You have learned too much for that. You have grown too much for that. Your heart deserves something steady. Maybe that is what this entire experience was trying to teach you. Sometimes we think we are waiting for another person. But really, we are waiting for clarity. We are waiting to understand what we deserve. We are waiting to recognize our own strength. We are waiting to stop confusing longing with destiny. And sometimes the greatest spiritual message is not, "This person is coming back." It is, "You will be okay no matter what happens." That is freedom, that is peace, and strangely enough, that is also when love becomes healthier, because when you know you will be okay without someone, you can choose them without fear. You are no longer holding on to them because you cannot survive without them. You are choosing them because they add something meaningful to a life you already value. That is the kind of love worth building. So let last night's words settle without forcing them into a conclusion. You're the one I love. Beautiful words, powerful words. But now let time reveal whether those words become a consistent reality. Perhaps the person will reach out. Perhaps they will finally explain what happened. Perhaps they will apologize. Perhaps they will admit how conflicted they have been. Perhaps they will tell you what they were afraid to say before. And when that moment comes, listen. Do not only listen for the words you have wanted to hear. Listen for accountability, listen for clarity, listen for sincerity, listen for whether they understand the impact of their choices, and if they ask for another chance. Remember that another chance is not the same thing as unlimited chances. A second chance can be beautiful when both people use it to create something healthier. But forgiveness should never require you to ignore repeated disrespect.